Islamabad's spring air was thick with tension as US and Iranian officials met in secret, racing against time to prevent a catastrophic war. The world watched anxiously, knowing the fragile ceasefire, brokered by former President Trump after a US-Israeli strike killed Iran's supreme leader, was set to expire. The Strait of Hormuz, now a flashpoint, saw Iran demanding tolls and blocking passage, while the US responded with a naval blockade. The human toll was staggering. Thousands dead across Iran, Lebanon, Israel and US forces, with families shattered and economies reeling. Every rumor from the negotiation rooms sent shockwaves through global markets and military command centers. The diplomats in Islamabad faced a stark reality. Failure meant plunging the world back into chaos. The Islamabad talks exposed a chasm between US and Iranian demands. The US, led by Vice President J.D. Vance, insisted Iran abandon its nuclear ambitions and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Iran, led by Speaker Ghalibaf, demanded immediate sanctions relief and the release of $27 billion in frozen assets before discussing the strait. For Washington, Iran's nuclear program was an existential threat. For Tehran, sanctions were collective punishment. The US demanded total dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program, while Iran insisted on its right to peaceful enrichment under the NPT. Both sides saw their positions as non-negotiable, each viewing the other's demands as a threat to sovereignty or security. The talks revealed a clash of world views, US power versus Iranian defiance. Neither side was willing to make the first major concession, locking the negotiations in deadlock. Despite animosity, the Islamabad talks saw glimmers of hope. Both sides discussed prisoner exchanges and limited humanitarian access to Iran's frozen assets for food and medicine. A handful of cargo ships were allowed through the strait, testing de-escalation. Yet these gestures skirted the core issues: nuclear capability and sanctions. Each side viewed the other's moves with suspicion, seeing them as tactical rather than genuine. The fragile progress quickly faded, unable to bridge decades of mistrust. The talks collapsed when both sides refused to budge on their core demands. The US insisted Iran dismantle its nuclear program and reopen the strait before any sanctions relief. Iran demanded its assets be released and sanctions lifted before any movement on the strait. Past betrayals fueled Iran's refusal to act first. After the talks failed, President Trump announced a total US naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, escalating the crisis. Iran responded with military deployments and declared the strait under its control. The diplomatic stalemate gave way to a perilous military standoff. Both sides dug in, preparing for confrontation. The Strait of Hormuz is the world's most vital economic choke point, carrying a fifth of global oil and gas. Iran's blockade and tolls weaponized this vulnerability, stranding hundreds of tankers and triggering attacks on shipping. The US naval blockade aimed to restore passage, but heightened the risk of direct conflict. The presence of rival militaries in such a narrow space created a tinderbox. A single clash could shut the strait entirely, sending oil prices soaring and crippling economies worldwide. Asian and European nations, heavily reliant on Gulf energy, faced looming catastrophe. Even the US, less dependent on Gulf oil, saw its allies and global markets at risk. Control of the Strait of Hormuz became a battle for global economic stability. The crisis sent oil prices to record highs, fueling inflation and threatening economic recovery worldwide. Disruptions in the Persian Gulf created shortages in fertilizers and helium, impacting food production and technology. Global supply chains buckled with ripple effects across industries. Geopolitically, China and Russia backed Iran, straining relations with the US and its allies. European nations urged de-escalation, caught between security ties and economic needs. Inside Iran, a government-imposed internet blackout stifled dissent and isolated citizens. 88 million Iranians faced uncertainty, trapped in an information vacuum as war loomed. For Middle Eastern nations, the crisis was an existential threat. Gulf states ramped up defenses, fearing Iranian attacks on vital infrastructure. Saudi Arabia, while benefiting from high oil prices, dreaded being drawn into war. Oman, a traditional mediator, struggled to maintain neutrality as tensions soared. In Lebanon, Israeli strikes on Hezbollah continued, threatening to ignite a wider conflict. The region braced for escalation, with security heightened and anxiety palpable. The failure of talks left neighbors staring into an abyss, preparing for a storm they might not avoid. As the ceasefire neared its end, the world faced three paths: a last-minute peace, a dangerous stalemate, or devastating war. A comprehensive peace deal seemed unlikely, with trust shattered and positions entrenched. The most probable outcome? A tense stalemate. US blockade versus Iranian resistance, constant skirmishes and economic pain. The risk of miscalculation loomed, threatening to trigger all-out war and global recession. Regional powers could be drawn in, multiplying the human and economic cost. The world held its breath, hoping for a diplomatic miracle. The choices made in Washington and Tehran would shape global security for years. The future hung in the balance, the next chapter unwritten.